This was Cloud's territory. Someone was working in the field, harvesting the crops, and a man was approaching a stately woman who stood alone and gazed into the distance. The girl looked at the wheat fields and the houses in the distance. The man had brought her a warm cloak, for it was very windy outside. The young man threw a shawl over her shoulders and carefully asked if she was cold. She smiled at her suitor and thanked him for showing concern for her. But their idyll together was shattered by her question about when they would start preparing the divorce papers. They were just then in the bedroom, apparently not so long ago indulging in voluptuousness, but hearing the girl's question, the man changed in his face, as he did not expect such a development of events. The woman looked at him and reminded him like a small child that their marriage contract was about to expire and they needed to prepare the necessary papers for the dissolution of their marriage. The man pretended not to know what she was talking about. The woman did not understand what was happening and asked the man if he had forgotten the terms of their marriage. He tried to ignore her, turned to the other side and said that he was very tired and would sleep. Such behavior did not please the girl, and she became indignant. Though the man had turned away and covered himself with a blanket over his head, he was awake and staring at one point. When the girl left his room, he sat on his bed and thought about the fact that in the beginning he should have made the contract last for 100 years, but he only realized it after they had lived together for a year and a half. If you think about it well, not much had changed in his life and their relationship, so he didn't understand why his wife's decision to divorce was so difficult for him to accept and follow. He was well aware that even 3 years ago, he could not have thought of such life events. Memories. 3 years ago, at an aristocratic soiree, people were dancing, gossiping, drinking champagne. But one lady was not dancing, drinking, or gossiping. She stood alone at the window and gazed off into the distance. At that very spot, fleeing from a crowd of tedious nobles, ran out cursing Viscount Hubert Cloud. For the ballroom was becoming more stuffy by the minute, and the unmarried girls and their mothers began to take an unhealthy interest in him, pestering him with various questions. The atmosphere among the men was no better. Some were asking him why he was so careful at parties, whether it was because he used to be a mercenary. Others were speculating about expensive wine. It seemed to the Viscount himself that they all just wanted to pick a fight. As Hubert was hiding from the nobles, a beautiful woman in a pink dress came up to him and said she was very pleased to meet him. The Viscount was angry, for he had not expected anyone to follow him to the terrace. But as much as he didn't like the situation, he didn't want to fall foul of it, so he only smiled faintly at the stranger. The stranger's name was Lavia, and she was the daughter of Count Arista. The man asked her politely what she was doing here, and why she was not among the other guests of the evening. The girl confessed that it was quite by chance that she was lucky enough to get into the Information Guild, where she heard something interesting about the Viscount. Namely, Lavia learned that Hubert was looking for a woman who would agree to marry him. This woman had to respect his privacy, wealthy and of noble status. The Viscount's face changed. He hadn't realized that the Information Guild's personal data security system was worse than ever. The guild was his only option for finding a mate, since he had limited money. Hubert realized that the money he paid to the guild was the only money he earned during his time as a mercenary, the rewards of his title and the taxes from his modest estate, so there was no way he could avoid a budget deficit. The man tried to prove to his new acquaintance that she had been misinformed, and everything she had heard was not true. But Lavia did not try to condemn him, but instead came to offer him a favourable deal. The young man looked at his new acquaintance incomprehensibly and asked her to clarify what it was really about. The girl said that she was not going to ask him for much, but proposed to conclude a marriage contract on mutually beneficial terms. In addition, they could settle a number of property issues if they wanted to. The Viscount realized that the Countess Arista was now proposing to him. The head of their house was a very greedy man, so they had managed to save up quite a lot of money. But this very greed of the head of the family led to the Emperor no longer trusting him. Besides, the young man had never thought of the Count's daughter as a potential wife, for he had not expected the high-ranking lady to agree to accept his proposal, for he could give nothing to his future wife, for he had nothing left but a crumbling estate and the title of Viscount. Hubert knew that there were many girls in their country who aspired to a higher title. The man knew that a good option for him would be to marry the daughter of some wealthy merchant who dreamed of becoming a viscountess. He believed that might be enough if it benefited both parties. But he was in no hurry to agree to such a proposal, and said that there are such creatures on the battlefield who seduce others with sweet speeches. Lavia was surprised that a man who had real knightly experience spoke in such beautiful metaphors. Plus, she didn't realize if she was like a spy or someone trying to seduce him with sweet speeches. Hubert had nothing of the sort in mind, but he constantly reminded himself to be extremely careful about all the decisions he made in this life. This was very understandable to the girl, so she checked with him to see if there was anything specific he wanted to discuss. The young man asked only one question about what benefits would open up to the Count's daughter if she helped someone like him. She did not refuse to answer, but simply offered to discuss a few conditions. The first was a contractual agreement, limited to 3 years, during which she would support the Viscount in any way she could, and he could use her for his own purposes. The whole situation tensed the Viscount, as he still did not understand the lady's motives. Oddly enough, the girl wanted to be someone worthless, which is why she offered him marriage. But no matter how hard the young man tried, he could not understand the girl, so he asked her to give him a more detailed explanation. Lavia explained. Her father is a very pragmatic man, and he did not care about her feelings and desires, so he is ready to use her as a pawn in his intrigues and palace games, because he sees in her only a tool to achieve his goals. So when she heard about the Viscount, she decided to take the first step and decide her own fate. In addition to everything else, the girl knew that in their society, a divorced woman was treated as a criminal, which would give her an opportunity to free herself from her father, who could not do anything about such a situation. Hilbert, on the other hand, was not like the father of the beautiful girl. He was concerned that if he agreed to this marriage and then divorce, would he not put the girl in a difficult position? Besides, he reflected that since the girl was the daughter of an earl, he too would sooner or later become a target for criticism and gossip, but accepting guilt and hardship was a form of pride for him. But such trifles did not bother Lavia, because after the divorce from the Viscount, she was going to go on a trip, because she always wanted to explore distant lands, as well as learn fencing from the best master in the world. So she asked him not to worry, and asked him how he was going to handle the situation, and added that she was going to do her best to support him, if they do get married. The young man pondered. He realized that 3 years was not such a long time. Besides, he, as a Viscount, would be obliged to provide himself with funds for that period of time. After thinking some more, he shook the girl's hand and said that he had no reason to refuse such an offer. So the girl offered to start by telling her greedy father about their marriage. And rumour has it that they've already had a night of passion together. So Hubert and Lavia had a date and visited the theatre. The young man was absolutely delighted, as he really enjoyed the spectacle. The girl was restrained in expressing her emotions, but noted that this performance was on a par with a famous actor. The Viscount, however, was glowing with delight. He thought that what he had seen was 100 times more interesting and impressive. Days earlier, at that very royal banquet, the two of them entered the hall together, under the arm, which created a wave of instant rumours. Everyone noticed that they left the event together too. And then a man and a woman often visited one of the hotels in the city and slept in the same room. In a word, did everything to make people believe that they had an affair, and began to talk about it at every turn. It was clear that the rumours spread around faster than the wind, and that was the whole calculation. So it wasn't a year before the couple started spending their days as lovers. So society invented a love story that transcended social status, and word of it spread throughout the kingdom, and the girl's father had no way of preventing it. Lavia and Hubert became for everyone a couple from a fairy tale, and the performance they played in front of the girl's father was worthy of an Oscar and made an unforgettable impression on him. The young people were unable to wed, but the marriage documents were officially recognised, which was Count Arista's first defeat. When all the necessary documents were signed and the guy and the girl were left alone, she began to open a chest in front of him, saying that it contained the funds for the property. The Viscount was shocked at the amount of money that was there, and Lavia said that the more means to manage the estate, the better. So she exchanged the allowances and gifts she received for money. Besides, the girl did not want to see her father for a short time, so she collected all the money she could get quickly. The girl felt fine, as she realised that the initial funds should have been enough to run the Viscount's estate. At that very moment, the Viscount thought that a real angel was sitting before him, so he thanked her from the bottom of his heart. Lavia was sure that for the sake of the bright future she had chosen for herself, then she shouldn't be saving up to invest right now. And then she reminded her husband that she had promised to help him, so she would. The Viscountess realised that since the deal was done, she had no desire to waste any of it, so she was going to give her husband all the things he wanted and desired. Nevertheless, she asked the man to make her one promise. The gist of it was that once they each got what they wanted, they would dissolve their prenuptial agreement. The Viscount agreed to such terms without question and gave her a promise to that effect. The girl asked him to seal his words with an oath on his little fingers. Lavia gave him instructions. It was necessary to put her and his little fingers against each other. And so, sitting opposite each other in the carriage, they sealed their promise with an oath on their little fingers. It was one of the customs of a distant country, of which the girl had been told by her tutor, and thus they bound their hearts together. The man wasn't particularly familiar with such customs, but he wasn't the only one. The girl didn't know much about it either. Nevertheless, the girl said that once they arrived at the estate, they would be sure to spell out all the terms of the prenuptial agreement. As soon as they were done with that, they would deal with the real estate and the future of the man. The Viscount agreed to this, but then warned the girl that as of today, his estate was in decline, for he had done nothing to preserve it and had not studied stewardship. As life went on, the only thing he was 100% sure of was winning the battle on the battlefield. There he always felt his superiority, no matter who his opponent was. But lately he had realised that dealing with nobles was much more difficult than getting a victory in battle. In addition to all this, his rise in status was linked to a moment of survival, so in many issues now, he lacked education in scientific matters. Lamia said there was nothing wrong with that, as she would help him in this matter, for she often kept an eye on matters at the Count's estate. However, the girl realised that in order to properly manage the estate, she still had a lot to learn. Lavia realised that she would do her best to learn if he wanted to help her with it. Plus, it was a great way to have more than just a title of nobility. Lavia said aloud that they should both do their best to achieve their goals. And afterward, she added that she would be very grateful to him if he added to her road funds in the future. The Viscount was also determined. He was even willing to open his own store to improve his financial situation. And Lavia only smiled, for she realised that the longer she talked to him and looked at him, the more she realised that this man did not fit into the circle of nobility at all. But suddenly he became very serious and said that they would arrive at the place soon, but he was obliged to warn her that the winter in their estate would be very severe. She admitted that the cold didn't bother her much, as long as the heating system worked well. This was the problem, as the heating system in his house had not been fixed yet. This carelessness surprised the Viscountess, as winter was just around the corner and it was already cold outside. The man didn't know what to say to this and only blushed with embarrassment, while the girl informed him that she had no desire to die of cold in his house. As luck would have it, they reached the mansion, and when they opened the doors and stepped inside, the girl opened her mouth in surprise. It was very dirty inside. Everything was covered in cobwebs, and spiders were crawling on the walls. The young man wanted to fall under the ground for the first time out of shame. The outside was little better than the inside. Everything was overgrown and had lost its presentable look. And besides, winter was just around the corner. Lavia realised that everything was frozen intentionally, and it looked like it was an abandoned house, not an apartment building, so it was going to be quite a challenge to solve this problem as well. Since the issue needed to be resolved somehow, she suggested that they turn to a professional. They needed someone to manage the estate, preferably someone who had done it before. At this point, the Viscount began to look around, murmuring that there was one such person. At that moment, like a devil out of a snuff box, a round, drunken man appeared. He went towards the Viscount and his wife, saying strange words. Lavia was speechless, and when he returned, the first thing she asked was if it was some kind of humour joke. But it wasn't a joke, and the estate manager, Melbourne. The girl was aware that Hubert did not really fit into the circle of nobility, but even from him she had not expected such a thing, as it was not a good story at all. So even though she realised it was her first day at his house, it was still sometimes necessary to say unpleasant things right away, so she could have a chance to address the problem later. The man thought it would be nice to avoid problems over property issues. His wife asked him to realize and take note that although he had not received the largest estate in the remote northern region, he was still a nobleman, so he could not allow anyone to ignore him, and especially not a servant who looked down on him. Hubert knew she was right, so he promised her that he would be more careful now and remember her words for the rest of his life. Melbourne, the caretaker, had not yet realized that the situation had changed, and brazenly asked about who Lavia was. For her, she did not like this attitude and behaviour, as she believed that a servant should be reserved in front of his boss, and the keeper continued in the same vein, famously addressing the Viscount, asking him where he could find such a fish for himself. Lavia's patience ran out, and she ordered the servant to straighten up in a stern and threatening tone that did not tolerate any objections. The girl, however, said that from this moment she was Viscountess Cloud and mistress of this estate, and then added that she had heard of the man before her from her husband. Afterwards she inquired as to whether he had been single-handedly managing the Viscount's property. The servant confirmed it. Melbourne tried to whitewash himself and said that owing to certain circumstances beyond his control, he himself had been left alone on the estate to manage it. This all displeased the girl very much. The Viscountess thanked the man for his work, but then handed him a bag of money and told him it was his severance pay, as he was fired as of now. The man accepted the money, but then started to backpedal, saying that she couldn't accept it, as everything happened very unexpectedly. But the girl didn't really care, as she was going to hire a new manager. The Viscountess added that the man has lived in this house all this time and has done nothing but drink, so a servant who is more subject to alcohol than to his master, so the Cloud House doesn't need him. Melbourne threw up at this point, and Livia said that a man who can't take care of himself can't take care of a mansion. She did it for a reason. After all, the girl could be patient and lenient for quite a while, but that's only until people cross the line. Then Livia looked into her husband's eyes and said that Hubert should not overestimate people either, including those who worked on the estate, nor did he have the right to underestimate himself, as such a thing could bring shame on his house. Hubert didn't quite understand her, so the girl began to explain it all to him, saying that he shouldn't forget about the people who worked on the estate, because the reputation of the estate depended on their reputation. It began to dawn on the young man he realized that it was like being insulted, and that would mean insulting his knights. Lavia, however, understood that her husband would have to learn to think like a nobleman, so if such analogies were necessary for him, so be it. So the girl said that the estate was like a young man's order of knighthood, and he was the knight who was at the head of that order and protected it. Hubert understood her and said that he would remember it always. So now Lavia asked how far the nearest town was, because they needed to hire a new caretaker for the manor. The Viscount nodded his head, agreeing to go there. The Viscountess realized that her husband was a very good man, full of enthusiasm, and then said that they had other things to think about as well. When the Viscount and Viscountess were left alone, they began to draw up the terms of their marriage contract. The document in her hands the girl held and reread the clauses once more. It said that they would reside in a legal marriage from that point forward, and committed to several points in the agreement. 1. They will do their best to fulfill that contract, and 2. They will not have a relationship on the side during the period mentioned above. 3. They will live in the same room for the entire time, but physical contact will be minimized, but contact will be allowed to fulfill the contract. But once all the terms of the prenuptial agreement are fulfilled, then they can divorce and each go their own way. But there was also a clause in the document stating that if the fulfillment of the terms of the contract would be difficult for one or both parties, they could terminate the agreement early. But in this case, the party who violated the terms would have to pay the affected party 50 gold luvels. In addition, if the need arises, more clauses can be added to their contract if necessary. After the signatures were affixed, they took their copy of the contract for safekeeping. Afterward, they shook hands and asked each other to take care of themselves. So their family routine began. They arrived in town and began to look for a place where they could place advertisements to hire a few maids and a butler. Hilbert noticed that his wife did not calm down for a minute. Lavia turned around, looked at her husband, and said that the house needed to be kept clean. Her words and smile hit his heart with an amorous arrow. The girl surprised him day after day. It turned out she was an excellent horsewoman, something she'd learned from her fencing teacher. The Viscountess was sure she could ride far better than most soldiers. This made the young man look at her with admiration. But for some reason, Hilbert suddenly changed his face and called his wife worriedly, to which she said that she had gotten a very calm and nice horse. The man admitted that he didn't expect her to be so good at riding, and the girl added that not only does she ride a horse well, but she fences at a high level too. The Viscount no longer even tried to conceal his admiration for his wife. After a while, they reached the right organisation. They were greeted by a friendly girl who asked them if she could help them. Lavia asked her where they could place a job advertisement. The counsellor gave them a stack of forms and told them that they could write the necessary information on those forms, thus creating recruitment posters, and then bring them back to her. A separate poster had to be created for each vacancy, and it was imperative to include the location of the job and the exact salary on it. Upon hearing this, Lavia interrogated her husband about whether or not Melbourne was the sole caretaker of his estate. The man said that So, the girl set about making posters. She realised that they needed several maids, one butler. It would also be a good idea to hire a cook and a gardener. It seemed too much to Hilbert after all. He shouldn't have hired so many people, as the money issue was still unstable and open-ended. Lavia explained that if they wanted to attract new people, they needed to learn how to invest properly, and this was the bare minimum of staff needed for their estate. The girl explained to the man that when the estate started to flourish, they would need a lot more people than she wanted to hire now. When Hilbert looked over his wife's shoulder and saw how much she had put in her salary, he almost felt sick, so she put her hand over his mouth in time for him not to say anything. After all, she specified the amount of 2.5 million, but the girl was sure that if the manager was good and could do all the necessary work properly, this amount was not so big. 1.7 million the girl was offering each maid who would work for them. So, the amounts the poster girl quoted were about 25% above the usual average price for such services, especially when you consider the availability of housing and other benefits. It was a very generous offer. The Viscountess watched her husband. She realised he was doing calculations in his mind, and the results shocked him as he still thought like a mercenary and not a nobleman. Lavia admitted that she had never seen or interacted with mercenaries before, but she had heard that neither those around her nor the members of the profession themselves valued their own lives or put them above the price of cattle. But now they were in the world of nobles, not mercenaries. So the girl explained to the Viscount that every worker performs his duties better and feels more attached to his boss and place of work when he gets a high salary. Besides, since they would all live in the same house, they should be treated as family members. Although it was difficult for the young man all this, but nevertheless, he agreed with his wife, saying that the mercenaries spent only 100,000 on the battle, so such sums for him seem exorbitant. Afterward, Hilbert smiled genuinely and said he was happy to have a wife like Lavia. The girl was embarrassed, as it was strange for her to receive this kind of praise, but it did not make her any less pleased and happy to receive it. They were about to leave, and the girl told her husband that all the responses to the applications would be sent to the manor. If they found a suitable person and wanted to arrange an interview, the guild would mediate between them and would receive a percentage for it. Several months passed. Hilbert and Lavia were about to go to bed when they saw a heart of rose petals on the bed, a bottle of whiskey, and 2 glasses on a tray. Hilbert poked his finger in the direction of the bottle confusedly and asked what it was all about and what it meant. Lavia looked at the bottle and the appetizer and offered her husband a drink, since everything had already been prepared especially for them. Hilbert thought for a second and then agreed, as he thought it was a great idea. So, ever since the new employees arrived at the estate, the Viscountess herself had been working tirelessly. The Viscount too could not rest, as he, following his wife's errands, travelled to various places, procuring supplies and hiring personnel. So they haven't been able to spend time together for months, which is why they got such a romantic surprise today. The man was now scrutinising the label on the liquor bottle, and the girl asked him if she remembered correctly that they had last seen each other about a week ago. Meanwhile, Hilbert uncorked the bottle and said they were always too tired after work to do anything else. During this time, they managed to pay off all the debts that had accumulated for the estate before, and hired new work staff. Lavia said she spent a quarter of her savings, that she was able to accumulate before their prenuptial agreement began to do so. The young man could not hide his emotions when he saw his wife at work, because she did everything quickly and clearly, from negotiating various issues with different people to solving urgent problems. Therefore, he did not stand still and learned everything he needed from his wife. They were having a drink and making conversation. The girl asked him if he had finished renovating the mansion. The man replied that he had finished all the repairs, so there would be no more ghosts in the neighborhood. He thought that everything the girl touched began to sparkle. Sipping her drink, Lavia realized it was quite strong. But that didn't stop Hilbert from drinking it like water and not even breaking a sweat. But alcohol started to do its work, and the man had already loosened his tongue. He said that on the way, he was robbed by some guy, and it happened at the moment when he was distracted, trying to tell him how to find the right road. Lavia also flushed and asked her husband about whether he was a titled knight and a well-known mercenary in tight circles. That was really it, so he caught up and immobilized that guy, even though he was very agile and running back and forth, but he wasn't that experienced, so it went well. In other words, the young man gave his opponent a good beating so that he wouldn't have to do it again. Lavia could not stand it and laughed, and Hilbert did not understand why she laughed, for he was not telling some joke. But to the girl, the whole situation and the way her husband talked about it looked very funny, so she couldn't contain her laughter. Suddenly, a mute silence hung between them in the room. It had been exactly 1 year since they had made the marriage contract, and one day a joyous Hilbert came running into Lavia's room. He sat down beside his wife and asked her if she knew who had come to see them today. The girl had no idea who was visiting them, so she politely asked her spouse about it. The girl reflected on the fact that it had been exactly a year since they had become husband and wife, and she was used to sharing a bed with a man. But it happened that they didn't see each other very often, as the young man had been in various battles, so he was often away from home. She had to deal with all the issues that went into running the estate, and so, after 3 long months, the Viscount finally returned home, and not for nothing, but with a decree from His Imperial Majesty. Indeed, lately, many orders from the Emperor had come home to them, but they all had to do with the call to war. And since Hilbert was a knight, he immediately went into the fire of battle. Meanwhile, Lavia poured tea and thought that a new decree for a man who had just returned home yesterday was too much of a burden and injustice, but aloud only clarified what kind of decree had come this time. For his successes on the battlefield, the young man was promoted to the rank and now held the title of Count. Of all the recent news, this was the one that made the girl the most happy. In addition to the new title, their holdings also became somewhat larger than they had been before, and to top it all off, he was also given awards for his participation in the war effort. Hilbert thought that all of this was only possible because of Lavia, but the girl believed that her husband had reached these heights with his prowess on the battlefield. But the man insisted on doing his own thing, as it was only because Lavia was taking care of all the chores in the manor that he was able to focus on the battlefield and win. That, of course, was all great, but they had one problem now, and that was the food supply and the lack of food supplies. The fact was that crops were inherently bad at tolerating cold weather, and in the north, where they lived, there was also a lack of sunshine, which made it even more difficult to grow crops, so they had food shortages every year, which led them to buy food from others, which led to various expenses. So if they could solve the crop problem, the money saved could be reallocated to other needs on the estate. But Hilbert did not know how to solve this problem, as it was an impossible task for him to develop a new variety of seed that would tolerate the cold well. Nevertheless, the girl wanted to solve this problem, as every year to suffer for lack of supplies, to spend money on them. She did not wish to do so. She then asked her husband if there had been heavy casualties on their side in the war. He told her that this time things had worked out better for them because their strategies were at their best, so the barbarians had been overwhelmed. Since everything worked out for the best, Lavia picked up her cup of tea and congratulated her husband on his new honours, lands and titles. The Viscount smiled and said that sometimes he had the impression that he had spent all his good fortune in meeting her. Lavia, on the other hand, admitted that when she started thinking about her idea for a marriage contract, she realised that she would most likely have to marry a fat and old nobleman. So she was glad that it hadn't happened that way, and that Hilbert had been so fortunate to fall into her lap. The exchange of pleasantries was completed, and the girl informed her husband that she was experimenting with a new farming technique and suggested that he go and watch her work in progress. They finished their breakfast and went to look at the experiments. Hilbert only now noticed that there were many new buildings around that were just being built. This was true, since Lavia planned to create places where tourists could stay overnight. The Viscount didn't understand what tourists could see in their northern lands. After all, it was flat land here, so he didn't really understand why she would build houses for tourists. The girl had a different opinion. She was going to build on as there was a steppe expanse here. Still, there was much to discuss, but now they were going to eat. Plus Hilbert had brought a small gift for her, but he had been very tired yesterday, so he hadn't handed it to her last night. The Viscountess rejoiced, for it had become their little tradition for her husband to bring her a small prize when he came home. Hilbert said she should look forward to the gift this time, as he had been thinking for a long time about what to get his sweetheart this time around. Lavia noticed that lately the man started to come very close to her. She thought that it was most likely because of his soft and kind character. The girl did not feel any discomfort from it. After that, the girl asked her husband if he had heard the information that a banquet in honor of the new year was planned at the Emperor's court. The Viscount had heard, but he had not been invited to the feast. Nevertheless, the girl said that he should go to this banquet with her. Since the other northern rulers would be there, it would be interesting and proper to discuss the harvest and the methods of managing the estates. And it would also be fine to discuss plans for the future. The problem was also that they had not yet been invited to the imperial palace, even though they had been married for a year. Nevertheless, one such invitation had come, and the man had to respond to it soon. The girl recognized the fact that they did not have time to attend such events. In addition, in the capital, was a huge influence of her father, Count Arista. But now that the situation was a little different, Hilbert asked his wife what she thought about the costumes made to order. He thought of the fact that though they didn't buy clothes for such occasions, so making a suitable outfit would be a good idea. So he said he would call a tailor for that purpose. The girl then asked her husband if he had repeated all the basics she had taught him earlier. Hilbert thought for a moment and said he had. The Viscount corrected himself and said that he had repeated everything, and while they were travelling in the carriage would continue to repeat everything he needed to know before the banquet began. As they sat across from each other, the girl reminded her husband that he needed to learn from the other northern rulers how they managed their estates. To do so, he would need to learn the strengths and weaknesses of their lands. Hilbert didn't understand why he had to do that, since Lavia could have found out all about it herself. But she couldn't do that, because the upper class doesn't see women as their equals when they talk about things like governance. The Viscount didn't understand why this was happening, since he thought he had outstanding knowledge in this matter. Then why not listen to her and discuss the matter with her? But the girl confirmed that even so, no one would talk to her on serious topics because she is a woman. The Viscount did not understand why this was the case, and why she should be excluded, even with such outstanding knowledge and ability. The man reflected on the fact that mercenaries had no such prejudices, as only those who survived regardless of gender or age won. And then the young man noticed that his wife had fallen asleep. He suddenly remembered that she had said that she was working on solving the problem with the crops, and it seemed that she was working every day until late at night. So now she was so tired that she was dozing off. So, they had been on the road for about a week with no rest. So they finally arrived in the capital of the empire. Lavia was glad that they had arrived at the place, for they had travelled too long. Hilbert agreed, because even if it took so long in the carriage, the body would still get stiff. The Viscount told his wife that her idea of going in a carriage was a very good idea, and then remarked that there were already many nobles in the place. They were just now being watched by some girl. The stranger stared at them intently, crossing her arms over her chest. In Viscountess Cloud, she recognized Count Arista's daughter. Lavia turned at the voice and recognized the woman as Lady Angelta, and muttered that it had been a long time since their last meeting. Stranger said that she was quite disappointed that Lady Lavia had not invited her to her wedding, and then reminded the girl that she had married, causing a stir in high society, after which she had been thrown out of the house. It was not the first time that Lady Angelta had had such a quarrel with the Viscountess, but this time she wished to end it quickly, for she was very tired during the journey. So, Lavilla said, if you believed all the rumours that wandered among the nobility, Then her acquaintance had made the Count tremble because of gambling, which was popular among the lower classes of society. And on top of that, when a woman gets bored, she calls in her maids and slaps them for no reason. But come to think of it, that's what scoundrels do. But that wasn't all. Lady Angel had caused many people to lose their homes, and she had to sell her body and eventually marry the Baron. At these words, the woman's face changed. Lavia then looked at her husband and said that she was 200% sure that he was faithful to her. And on top of that, he had been an earl instead of a viscount for a month now. But the stranger would not be satisfied. She thought that if Hilbert had received the title of earl, he was still a common thug. Lavia agreed that the woman was right about something, but she was going to be much more successful in 2 years than she was, so she asked her to leave her alone for the time being, because when the time came, she wouldn't be able to say a word in her direction anymore. On that note, Lavia decided to end their pointless dialogue. Lady Angelta's face twisted with anger. The woman thought the Viscountess was rude, but here Lavia reminded her acquaintance that her tone was much rougher than that. As soon as Hilbert and his wife reached the door to the inn, the man told her to go into the middle of it without worrying or fretting about anything, while calling her his beloved. This embarrassed the girl. She was now looking at her husband in a strange way, and the latter could not understand the reason for this look, and then answered him in the same tone, calling him her favourite, while shortening his name in a diminutive and affectionate way. The people around started to murmur and gasp, as it looked very cute, so they decided that the couple was acting like real newlyweds. Lavia then turned and looked at her acquaintance, and asked her that she should call her Lady Cloud from now on, for she had already relinquished her title as heir to the Earl's house. At the hotels, the manager immediately approached them and asked about their room reservation. The man said they had a reservation in his name. The hotel clerk confirmed their reservation under the name of Count and Countess Cloud, and the room was at number 5 on the 2nd floor. If they needed anything else, they could call the staff at any time. Lavia pondered. From the moment they acted like newlyweds in front of the inn, people started and continued to watch them, so she decided to hold her husband's hand some more. So they went to their room and started looking at it. The furnishings inside were very strange and unusual. There was one wide bed, and in the corner behind a curtain a bathtub filled with water. And then they began to laugh. The girl asked the young man if he had noticed the change in the Count's daughter's face during their dialogue. Hilbert said that she had a look on her face that was unpleasant to look at. Lavia didn't understand how her husband had come up with such a witty idea to annoy the Count's daughter. It seemed to her that the man should have been an actor instead of a knight. Hilbert, on the other hand, noted that his wife had also conducted this conversation quite successfully and beautifully, and fended off all the verbal blows from her rival. Lavia recognised that her husband turned out to be a very cool man. Hilbert remarked that his spouse possessed admirable eloquence. Laughing, the man grabbed the handle of his suitcase and said he should have changed. The girl said she would change in the bathroom. Hilbert suggested she do things another way. He said she should change in her room, and when she was done, he would call her in. It wasn't a bad idea, so she started to change so she already had a new dress on. The only problem was that she couldn't button it herself. She was having trouble tying the ribbons on her own in the back, so she had no choice but to call her husband for help. The man thought she had finished changing, but no, she asked to come out and help her for a few minutes. The man agreed and went out. The girl sat on the bed red as a cancer and looked at her spouse. The latter came up to her and asked her what was wrong and how he could help her. After that, Lavia stood up, turned her back to him, and asked if he could tie her ribbons. Hilbert was a little confused about what he was supposed to do, and then it began to come to him, so he blushed. Closing his eyes, the young man began to tie the ribbons on his wife's dress, but it happened that at one point she asked him to pull the ribbons tighter. Hilbert had no choice but to try to comply with her request, but he realised that if it started to tighten more, the girl wouldn't be able to breathe properly. At that moment, Lavia realised that all was well now, and that her husband had done a good job. The girl thanked the man, but then told him that they needed to do some things. Hilbert looked at her and then asked what they needed to do. Lavia replied that they needed to go to the Imperial Palace now, immediately. The young man looked at his pocket watch and noted that it was indeed time for them to go to the palace. They went downstairs and saw their recent acquaintance scandalised again, now with a hotel employee. Therefore, Lavia and Hilbert began to play again. The man told his wife that the carriage for Lavia was already served, because next to him she should no longer tolerate even a hint of difficulties. Lady Cloud turned to her husband and spoke of how they could have passed it by, but he chose to gloat over their rival. Hilbert remarked that he could not stand by when his favourite woman was being insulted in every way possible. Lavia looked at Hilbert and thought about the fact that he had called her the one and only a moment ago. The couple got into the carriage and set off. The girl noticed that the young man had very good acting skills. The man said that during his time as a mercenary, he had often had to hide his nature. Lavia reflected on the fact that her husband had done his best, and he had also achieved dizzying success, from a mere mercenary to an earl. Plus, even back when he was a mercenary, he got a lot of female attention. The silence was interrupted by a young man who asked his wife if it was normal to go to the emperor empty-handed, without a New Year's gift. Lavia said that it was normal, because the emperor was often bribed, so any gifts were forbidden. The girl looked at her husband and asked him to listen to her carefully, as they needed to prepare for what was going to happen next. The man didn't understand what the matter was, so his wife started explaining the situation to him again like a small child. The thing was that there were a lot of very unpleasant rumours around their couple. Some said that a commoner like Hilbert had no right to be where he was now, that Hilbert was just an irascible mercenary, and nothing more than that. Besides, the girl understood that the man must be very careful that he should not make any blunders, and that the nobles should take him for their own, for these very people thought and gossiped that Count Cloud was bored with barbarian battles, but they did not understand why he should be in their society. The man sighed. He found this as disgusting as possible. But the problem was that it was normal for the nobility, as many of their representatives took real pleasure in humiliating others. This was especially true of young, noble ladies. Rumours about them spread like a fire that could not be extinguished, even if there was not even a grain of truth in them. Lavia continued to look at her husband, and realised that no matter how she looked at him, he didn't fit in the circle of nobility at all. So after a moment, she asked him if he liked money and how much. The man agreed that he liked money, but how much he couldn't answer. In response to his wife's question about whether power was important to him, the man had already asked her about what form of strange banter he was getting into. For such out-of-the-ordinary conversation, they arrived at the imperial palace, and so the Count and Countess Cloud entered the palace. All eyes were directed at them. The nobles resented the fact that this couple had already arrived at the banquet. They were also called shameless, as they walked with their heads held high. The ladies did not understand the choice of Lavia's life partner. Hilbert realised that by any means necessary, he had to hold out until the celebration began. At this point, his wife called him over and told him that he was too tense right now, and reminded him that he shouldn't show these people his true emotions and feelings. What the ladies around them did not say, for example, one of the gossips was that Lavia managed to give birth to a child by Hilbert before the wedding, so her father gave them permission to marry, and then threw her out of the house afterwards. Count Arista has no idea how to behave with a man who spent half his life killing barbarians. Hilbert was beginning to lose his temper at all these words, for he was very, very angry. Seeing that the matter was beginning to smell fried, Lavia hugged her husband's arm tighter and told him to stop paying attention to the gossip of the nobles, and to think now only of her. The ladies of the county noticed how tightly Lumvia clung to her husband, so they figured she was just another damsel in distress who was head over heels in love with him. Lady Cloud began to talk again about the fact that this woman was always behaving in this way at all social occasions when a handsome man came into view, hence her nickname of Bat. Sir Cloud had not expected this. The men at the event were no better than the women. They did not understand why Lavia had chosen such an uninteresting commoner as that one, for there was nothing good in him, in their opinion. They assumed that the Count forced the girl to be near him by force. Hilbert understood that no matter how he courted his wife, there were a lot of young and not so young men who laid eyes on her. But there were also rumours that the girl rejected all her suitors abruptly and without regrets. Lavia confessed to her husband that the rumours that were spread about him were much worse than those that were spread about him. People often said about her that when she was bored, she spent money on dubious entertainments. And then the man laughed and said he was lucky to have a wife, as she was the best of the best. After the young man stopped laughing, He leaned over to his wife and asked her in confidence whether or not she wanted to put up with this state of affairs. But not receiving a clear answer, Hilbert took active action and shouted throughout the hall that there was a dog that was barking relentlessly at the guests. The young man did not stop and continued. He asked the nobles which of them was the owner of this dog and why he or she had not taught his pet manners. With his remarks, he drove everyone who came to the banquet into a stupor. Lavia had the impression at that moment that she could feel the sparks flying at them from all sides of her skin. One of the nobles looked at Hilbert and clarified what he had just dared to say. The young man did not like this treatment at all, so he asked his opponent who had given him the right to address him without due respect, in a very disparaging manner. The nobleman became angry and asked, now the Earl of Cloud, if he knew who he was. At that moment, Hilbert looked at his wife and asked her if he remembered correctly that the Count's son Maxim was now standing before them. Lavia nodded her head affirmatively. Lavia had a plan to make friends with all the northern rulers, among whom her husband would take a place of honour. But things as always went off the plan, and now he was scuffling with everyone he could. But she couldn't complain about him, since she herself had allowed him to show off a little bit. But if they were going to do something today, they had to do it in a big way. Lavia realised that an arranged marriage would only look successful if the couple was having fun together. Even if it was all pretend, they needed to talk convincingly about love. To everyone around them, they must have looked like a couple passionately in love. Meanwhile, Hilbert continued his strange dialogue. He suggested that he was probably mistaken, and that the man before him was not the Count's son, at which the latter became very angry. And Hilbert went on. He said it didn't make much difference whether he was a baron or a viscount, since he had a title either way, so he saw no point in listening attentively to some son of an earl who had shown him such shameful condescension. Lavia noticed that her husband had done everything perfectly. This guy, though he was the heir to his father's title of count, had not yet inherited it, so a familiar tone towards a man who had a title in high society was not allowed and was frowned upon. Afterward, Hilbert got down on one knee before his wife and said he loved her with all his heart and it was real. After these words, Hilbert bent down and tenderly kissed his beloved wife's hand. Lady Cloud looked at her consort and realised that he was far from calm, and anger was splashing in the depths of his beautiful eyes. But at this point, the girl realised that she could be there to provide moral support to her husband, but to intervene BVT from MTV? When he wanted something badly, she should not. The man then straightened up and looked into the crowd of nobles and said that he hoped that from now on, the nobles would start thinking about what they were saying and refrain from any rash and false rumours about his wife. The man realised that it probably wasn't enough to get them left alone, so he asked his wife to play along with him in their little act. The man said loudly for all to hear about the fact that everyone seemed to tolerate his assertive nature, but the girl realised that no one had told him about it. Lavia felt the unkind glances of the nobles, but still she and the others realised that her husband should be treated with due respect, since he had a title. He then held out his hand to her as if to invite her to dance or to follow him. The girl gladly accepted his offer. The event was over. The couple arrived at the hotel and went up to their room. The man asked his wife about whether he had done well today or not, for he felt that he had done better today, as he even felt more honourable. The girl taught her spouse manners from scratch. Everything that had to do with etiquette, posture, manners, speech, tone of voice, and so on. She taught him everything she had learned in her years of training as a child and young adult. Strangely enough, Hilbert turned out to be a very capable and talented student, so he quickly mastered this difficult science. So she praised him and said that he had done a very good job today. Nevertheless, the girl had a strong feeling that this evening was a failure. The man realised that the failure of their outing happened clearly because of him, which the girl confirmed without sparing his feelings, after which he apologised. Lavia was silent, knowing that her husband had seen and experienced much in his life. Suddenly her gaze stopped on his hand. She noticed that it was trembling. At that moment she realised what a plus it was that weapons could not be brought into the reception hall. Indeed, the gossip went on for quite some time. Many said that the royal evenings were only for a select few and not for everyone. Many thought it was disgusting to be in the same room with a former mercenary because he didn't meet their standards. Hilbert's strange behaviour clearly offended the young nobles. Besides, no parent likes and will not watch their child being insulted and abused. Nevertheless, what's done is done, and there's no turning back the clock. At that moment, Hilbert handed her a glass of red wine. The girl did not understand what was their reason for drinking alcoholic beverages. Hilbert smiled, then said that a glass of wine was a kind of bribe to her. Lady Cloud was surprised at this gesture, for this was the first time she had seen such a bribe in her life, for it was not a jewel, nor a gold coin, nor rare herbs, but only a single glass of red wine. Though she accepted the glass, she asked about whether it was too little, that she considered it a bribe. The young man took it as seriously as ever, so he began to justify that he had nothing but a glass of wine now, to which the girl replied that he could, for decency's sake, look for a gold coin in his pockets. Afterward, the man sipped some wine and noticed his wife trying to hold back a traitorous laugh. Meanwhile, the nobles continued to say various things. It all boiled down to the fact that Hilbert and Lavia had spent nights together before the wedding, so she soon became pregnant. And when Count Arista found out, he threw his daughter out of the house. Lavia also recalled that there were rumours that she became a lecherous woman and seduced various high-ranking and not-so-high-ranking men. There were no better rumours about Hilbert than there were about her. Here someone told someone that he led an immoral life and spent nights with different women, whom he did not even remember because of their number. If you think about it, even in that way, they were the perfect couple, a man with a promiscuous sex life and a seductive and lecherous girl. Lavia looked at her husband and told him that no matter how much the noble's attention was directed at them, she wondered whether he noticed it or not. Hilbert had noticed, and suggested that it was unpleasant for all these snobs to breathe the same air as the commoners. They put their glasses on the table and looked out into the crowd. The girl was a little surprised, so she asked her husband if he really held the opinion that all these people did not want to be in the same room with them, so they were looking at them like that. The man did not understand where he had gone wrong in his conclusions, so he asked his wife to clarify the situation for him. The girl decided to answer. She said that all these people should envy her because she had a very gentle, affectionate and devoted husband, and not them. At that very moment, the man put his arm around the girl, pulled her to him, leaned down to her lips and asked if she wanted to do something like that. The reaction of the prim nobility was predictable, even though they hadn't even had a real kiss yet. But then something changed, and Hilbert, blushing, pulled the girl away from him. Lavia did not understand what was going on, so she asked her husband why he did that. Then the events developed even more strangely. The young man said that nothing had happened, then abruptly turned around and started running away from his wife on the pretext that he would go and get them another glass of wine. Lavia took a sip of her drink and looked thoughtfully after her husband, still not understanding what had just happened to him. It's been exactly 6 months since that ill-fated New Year's Eve ball at the Emperor's castle. Hilbert, on the other hand, finally realised what had happened to him then and what it had become now. So, the young man was 300% sure that he would never love anyone. From the very moment he met his spouse, he did not notice or think about the fact that she was a very beautiful girl. And there was and could be nothing between them except the marriage contract. Nevertheless, he often thought of the fact that his wife became very sweet when she smiled. Suddenly, the protagonist hit his head painfully against a tree trunk, realizing that everything was clearly spelled out in black and white in their contract. The contract stipulated that as soon as things got better, they would terminate the contract, which would mean that everyone would go their separate ways. And also, they must not fall in love with each other, because even under those circumstances, the contract would be terminated. But it seems the man had fallen in love with his wife, so now he thought he was crazy. Hilbert calculated in his mind that it had been exactly 1 year and 7 months since he had slept in the same bed with Lavia. Hilbert realized that he was in trouble now, as sleeping in the same bed with someone you loved was difficult, as he dared not touch her. That was why he felt like hell at night at times. At that very moment, Lavia called out to him and asked him to come over to her. The man didn't just walk over. He ran up to his wife because he was afraid something might have happened to her. But nothing terrible happened. Lavia was just studying the plants, for she wanted to breed a variety of sowings that would be resistant to cold weather, so she offered her husband to read the matter with her. Hilbert was a little embarrassed, but said that of course he would sit next to her and watch the plants, and also noted that it was really quite cold outside. And as he sat down next to her, the girl said that he would be obliged to show his future wife that he was a reliable and responsible man who could be trusted. Those words were like a shot in the back for the man. But though he was hurt by the girl's words, he still asked her about what she wanted to do just here. For Cello studied the area. The girl drew some drawings on the ground with a stick and explained to her husband that she planned to put a strong fence around this place, and then to cover this very fence with thick material. Lavia said that this way they could close the plants and the heat could be kept behind the fence, which would mean that the plants could endure the winter cold. But Hilbert hardly listened to her and only looked at her beautiful, luscious lips. Hilbert now realized that he had overestimated his strength, for at the beginning of their contract, he had thought that there would be nothing difficult in it, that it would be enough for him to look at the girl and do ordinary things. But he remembered the scene after the Emperor's ball. He had been scolded by Lavia then, because she had thought that such behaviour was unacceptable to him, even if it had been done in jest, and it had been an act. Then he had done as she wanted, but now, when he looked back, he had no regrets whatsoever. Nevertheless, he now thought himself a real fool for falling in love with his wife, whom he had no right to love. The girl, however, was engrossed in her work, so she didn't notice that her husband was in the clouds. So she looked questioningly at him and asked him what he thought about her idea for the crop fence. The man knew it was all interesting and not bad, but for some reason he noticed that Lavia was more agitated than usual. Hilbert said the idea was interesting, and he understood how it would work if it snowed, but he didn't understand how it would all work when it rained, since rain is much more unpredictable than snow. All this time Lavia devoted to researching plants that were cold-tolerant, but still a good solution for saving crops had not been invented. The girl was already on her feet, so the man got up as well. He looked at her and asked her when she had last slept. She answered that it was yesterday, but it was the wrong question, so Hilbert asked again. He clarified from his wife how many hours yesterday she devoted to normal sleep. The girl could not answer and only looked away, so now he approached her, saying that he was grateful to her for the work she had done, which was invaluable to him. He thanked her for everything, for it was only through her labour and ideas that their estate was constantly developing. Lavia began to realize that her husband at times, when it was necessary to him, could be very insistent and did not give in to her. He always followed her and did not leave her until she went to bed, when she was tired. But that was not all. He was always muttering about sleep, food, warm clothes. It all bored the girl, and in order not to hear it any more, she gave in and did as he wished. The situation was similar now. Hilbert insisted that his wife should not argue with him and get a good rest today, but she wanted to at least test the new farming method before she left. But her husband wouldn't let her do that either. Now the girl for some reason was embarrassed and looked very nice, and the young man really wanted to embarrass her even more, but there was no one else around, so it would not be possible to use it as an excuse. Nevertheless, he held out his hand to her and asked her to come with him and rest. But Lavia objected that they didn't have much time left until the end of the contract, and there were so many things to do. At that moment Hilbert's face changed, which frightened his wife a little. He had never realized how much she kept track of dates, and how precisely she wrote everything down. The man pretended that nothing had happened, but except that Lavia had already noticed that something had happened, it seemed to her that her husband had hurt himself somewhere and was not telling her. She touched him, and immediately pulled her hand away as he was very hot, so she asked him what was happening to him. But here Hilbert answered her in a strange way. He said she was very cold. He then grabbed her hand and ran into the house, as he felt that she had spent too much time outside, and at this rate was sure to freeze to death soon, so they needed to get into the house quickly. Then the man stopped abruptly and told his wife that she should not be in such a hurry, because in a year and a half they had achieved so much they could even be called successful people, and they had about the same amount of time ahead of them to do things. And then he added that if the girl didn't manage to do what she wanted in that time, they could always extend their contract. La Villa agreed with him, saying that rushing is not always the right way to a good result, and that it often leads to people starting to tread on the ground. Lavia suddenly realized that she really did have a lot on her plate, so she needed a little break too. So she calmly went into the house and said that she was going to shower and sleep, and asked about her husband's plans for the day. He replied that he would soon go to trade with another territory. The man also said he could handle the task himself without her help, so she could rest. The girl teased him that he had finally become a true nobleman. Hilbert agreed with that statement, but noted that it only happened because of her efforts. And Lavia was already pondering whether she had saved enough money for her trip. Hilbert looked saddened and remained silent, but the girl interpreted his reaction in her own way. She thought he had changed his mind about giving her money for her trip. But that wasn't the case. The man didn't think spending money on her wishes and dreams was a waste of money. At that very moment, Lavia noticed that the carriage for her husband had already arrived, so she asked him, when he returned home from bidding, to wake her up. Hilbert left on business, and Lavia took a bath. At that moment she remembered the look on her husband's face. He looked like a puppy that was about to cry. She didn't understand what was happening to him, since she thought the money for the trip wasn't much compared to what she had already done for him. The girl considered herself not the kind of person who would regret such things. She was the kind of person who, if she wanted something, looked for ways to get it. A little time passed and the girl woke up alone again, for Hilbert had gone off to war again. As soon as the weather became more stable in the country began to erupt in new conflicts. But the barbarians remained a big problem, and there were the first signs of a future confrontation with a neighbouring kingdom. So Hilbert yesterday went on a mission. The girl understood whether it was a war or a conflict, but every 6 months to face something like this was unpleasant. The girl had been up for several nights and was now having trouble sleeping, but she still wanted to solve the food supply problem. To this end, she persevered in her study of materials and did research on agriculture. She was already beginning to be pissed off by the sight of wheat. Lavia realized that the climate in the north was very harsh, and normal temperatures only held for a few months of the year. Because of such fluctuations, the region's climate was not suitable for growing plants.